Good evening. My name is Paul Rezzo. I'm a junior here at Hillsdale College studying speech and theater. And tonight I'm honored to introduce you to Dr. Phil Gramm. Now, before I start, Dr. Arnn has required that I tell a joke. Unfortunately, I don't know any good jokes, so I'm going to steal one from President Reagan. Reagan said, "Balancing the budget is a little like protecting your virtue. You just have to learn to say no." Phil Gramm serves as vice chairman of UBS Investment Bank. Dr. Gramm holds a PhD from the University of Georgia in economics, previously served 24 years in Congress, including the last 18 years as a senator from Texas. Prior to that, he taught economics. Please. Prior to that, he taught economics at Texas A&M University. His legislative record includes bills such as the Gramm-Latta budgets, which reduced federal spending, rebuilt national defense, and mandated the Reagan tax cut, and the Gramm-Rudman Act, which placed the first binding constraints on federal spending. As chairman of the Banking Committee, Senator Gramm was responsible for legislation modernizing the banking, insurance, and securities laws. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act repealed the 70-year-old Glass-Steagall Act, which prohibited banks, securities firms, and insurance companies from affiliating. He has published numerous articles and books on subjects ranging from monetary theory and policy to private property to the economics of mineral extraction. And now, to speak to us about Reagan and economics, please welcome Senator Phil Gramm.
Thank you very much. As Paul mentioned, I'm sort of in my third life. I was a college professor and an economist in my first life, and then I was in public service for 24 years. And I guess it's fair to say anything having anything to do with money in American government for 24 years I was involved in. My mother once heard me say that and said, "Well, if it's true, I wouldn't brag about it." And then I turned 60. And I started thinking, well, what are you going to do when you grow up? And so I decided that I ought to make a rational decision about whether I ran again. So I got all my grandfather's and great-grandfather's death certificates. And I tried to figure out what my genetic envelope might look like. And then working backwards, I tried to ask the question, do you want to give 6 more years of service? And I never could get my family to state an opinion about it. In fact, in desperation, I got everybody on a conference call and say, "Look, this is going to affect your lives. I want to know what you think." So my baby son said, "Look, Pop, do whatever makes you happy, but you need to know at the first possible moment we're going to throw your ass in a nursing home and take your money." And my mother, with always the appropriate question, said, "You reckon when you're in intensive care and you're dying, you're going to be glad you spent 6 more years in the Senate?" And come to think of it, that was the relevant question. So I decided to quit while I was ahead. I gave 24 years of service to the greatest state, the greatest country in the history of the world. And I loved every minute of it. For the last 9 years, I've been in investment banking. I worked for UBS. I was there for the 5 fat years. I've been there for the 4 skinny years. The 5 fat years were better. I have been to Hillsdale before. I came Sometime around 1970, I was a young college professor, and I came here and gave a talk on energy. And then I came back with David Stockman in 1979 or 1980. I've known Larry for a very long time. I think very highly of him. And I think very highly of everything that Hillsdale stands for. I always urge my friends that have money to put your money where your principles are. Don't give money to a school simply because you went there. My wife went to Wellesley. She's proud of it, but we would never give them money. I want to talk about Ronald Reagan and about Reaganomics. And I want to try not to do what so many people like me do when they're asked to speak on subjects like this, and that is I don't want to get off on one Ronald Reagan story after another. I had an opportunity to get to know President Reagan before he was elected. And I can remember vividly when he took the oath and gave his speech, thinking that all my life, my views, what I stood for, what I believed in, had been hopelessly out of fashion. And that I really never expected to live to have a president who felt exactly like I did. And I determined that day on the western side of the Capitol that I wasn't going to waste this opportunity. And I'm proud to say that I did not. Let me talk a little bit about the world into which Reaganomics was born. The 1970s, for a myriad of reasons, were not a happy period. We had a combination of stagnation and inflation. The inflation rate peaked at 13.5%. Prime interest rates for a very short period of time were 21.5%. And we awakened to the fact that we had shared our secret, economic freedom, with the world. They were beginning to practice it. It wasn't that we were so much worse than we'd ever been, but all of our competitors were better. And to quote Jimmy Carter, a malaise had set into America. And there were real questions, real honest-to-God questions, about whether or not time had passed America by. It was in the headline of Time magazine, the joy ride over. Did we really need, as Jimmy Carter said, to learn to live on less? Was less more? And this debate in the 1970s is what drew me into public office. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. I was sort of a product of American opportunity. And the idea that the age of America was over was unthinkable to me. The problem was I didn't know many people, and the people I knew didn't like me. And so I set out on a political quest driven by values to run for public office. And so I arrived in Washington 2 years before Ronald Reagan did. I was from the South. My grandmother thought all Republicans were those guys in blue shirts who had burned down her grandmother's house. I'd never met a Republican until I was grown. Now, I knew by the time I was elected to Congress that there was a difference between how most Republicans thought, most Democrats thought, but those differences didn't make any difference to me. I found when I got to Washington, I was the only person that didn't make any difference. But when Ronald Reagan came 2 years later, I wasn't going to let parties stand between me and what I had come to Washington to do. And I had the great privilege of helping to put together and helping to pass the Reagan program. Now, Reaganomics was as old as economics, and it was brand new. The old part was that water wets and fire burns, and basically you have to make decisions about how you're going to allocate resources, that you can't have unlimited freedom and unlimited government. That government in the 1970s was too big, too powerful, too expensive. And we didn't want it even if it was free. And these were old ideas which Reagan explained well and very credibly in terms people could understand. But there was a new element to Reaganomics, and I think looking back, it was a very powerful element. Now, it was not new to economists, but it was new to the political debate. And the idea sounds trivial when you talk about it, but it was a very powerful idea. And the idea was that tax rates affect people's incentives to work, save, and invest. And if you have lower rates, you create more economic energy, and that economic energy generates economic activity, and that produces a flow of revenues to the government. And this was a theory that was honed by Art Laffer, and the president presented it as the new part of his program. And it was new politically, and at first the media was totally skeptical. The public was skeptical, but in the end, the program worked. And I want to talk about the program tonight because the program was not about personality. It wasn't about political parties. It was about policy. And the test was, does the policy work? And it did. Now, there were some inconvenient constraints that Reagan had when he took office that could have easily made it impossible for his program to succeed. We were in the process, with the support of the president, of breaking the back of inflation in America, and the Federal Reserve Bank had tightened down on the money supply in 1981 and 1982, and the economy had slipped into the steepest recession in the post-war period. Secondly, we were faced with the challenge of the Soviet Union that was on the march all over the world. We were in retreat in virtually every area of the world, and President Reagan was determined to rebuild national defense as part of a program of peace through strength. Neither of these constraints worked to our advantage in the battle of reviving the American economy. They both worked strongly against us. So at the end of this speech, I'm going to compare the Reagan recovery to the current recovery. And the point that I want you to keep in mind is we have had the most accommodating monetary policy in the history of America in this current recovery. In the Reagan recovery, we had a very restrictive monetary policy. And very much to his credit, Reagan understood that inflation had to be broken, and he never complained about what the Fed was doing, and he was always supportive. Now, it took a special political coalition to pass the Reagan program, because when the president was elected, Republicans won the Senate, but they did not win the House. In fact, the Democrats at their lowest point had a 26-vote margin in the House of Representatives. Fortunately, 2 years before, a group of conservative Democrats, all of them from the South and the border states, had put together a group trying to begin to get a debate going about deficits and about the explosion of government. And the Democrats were so confident in their control of government that it didn't matter to them what we were doing. It seemed irrelevant to the debate. And then all of a sudden, when the votes were counted in November of 1980, this group of roughly 30 Democrat congressmen that I was actively involved in became part of the governing majority in the House of Representatives. Now, Reagan was able to take the case for his program above Congress's head to the American people. And there's no doubt about the fact that Reagan was a great communicator and that was a critical ingredient. But I guess I would say, having been there every day during this battle, that while Reagan was a great communicator, the key was not his ability to communicate, it was the ideas he was communicating. Reagan always claimed, even to the day he left office, that he was not a great communicator, he was a communicator of great ideas. And I agree with that. And what we had to do was to convince every Republican we could lose 2 Republicans if we could hold the 26 Democrats we had. And the 26 Democrats never wavered. But right at the end, about 40 Republicans started to waver. Now, you don't remember this, but the Reagan program was a tough program. It eliminated 3 Social Security benefits in one day. Killed them cold turkey, boom. It killed the adult student benefit, the minimum benefit, and the death benefit in one day, in one vote. And it was a dramatic change in public policy. And what happened, I want to share one Reagan story with you because I think it tells you something about the man and how he worked and how he led. The president called me and said, you know, we got about 40 Republicans that are threatening to revolt. Do you think we ought to try to begin to make some marginal changes in the program? And I said, well, I would be willing to make changes, but here's the problem. If we start making changes, we sort of lose the moral high ground that this is a coherent program. And I'm afraid for everybody that we put something back that they want, there'll be 3 more members who will want something else. And the whole thing could unravel. So anyway, the president never told me what he had concluded, but the next day, 40 Republicans along with myself, were invited down to the White House, and everybody sat around the extended cabinet table. And so Reagan came into the meeting, and he said, well, I didn't come to give you a pep talk. You all know what the program is about. I came to listen to you. And so he put his hand on the shoulder of the guy sitting next to the president. I wish I remembered who it was. But anyway, this guy said, well, Mr. President, I'm with you. I'm for this program. My problem is my constituency. And it must have sounded great because by the time we got all the way around that table, about 75% of the members of Congress that were at this meeting had said almost identically the same thing. It wasn't them, it was their constituency. And so anyway, I have not, at the time, not the foggiest idea what the president was going to say. And so he sat there, and it felt like 5 minutes of just silence. And of course, everybody's eyes just glued on the president. I mean, these were heady times. And then he said, well, I must have been confused. I thought this was about country. I didn't know this was about constituency. And he got up and left. And let me tell you the miracle. Not one person in that room voted against the Reagan program. It passed by one vote. If one person had voted the other way, the Berlin Wall might still be standing for all I know. Now, what did the Reagan program do, and what was Morning in America all about? And I don't want to bore you with statistics, but I want to just talk about what a difference government makes. What a difference good policies make to real, honest-to-God people. And so let me start by talking about Morning in America by saying that I believe, and I think the evidence is overwhelming, that the Reagan program, when fully implemented in 1983, brought in a 25-year golden age in America. It was 25 years where we had very rapid economic growth. We had only 2 recessions in 25 years, whereas we had had 4 recessions in the previous 12 years, and 2 of those were big recessions. The 2 recessions we had in 25 years were very, very minor recessions. Now, what was this Morning in America about? Well, Reagan, as everybody knows through his program, cut the top tax rate from 70% to 50%, 28%. Now, it's tempting to say, well, that's the top tax rate, and that was helping rich people. And of course it was. As I used to try to explain in Congress, no person poorer than me ever hired me in my life. If America's going to be saved, I used to say it's going to be saved at a profit. And when there was a profit, it was saved, I'm happy to say. But just listen to these numbers. In 1979, the top 1% of income earners in America paid 18.6% of the total tax bill. By the year 2006, they were paying 39.1% of the total tax bill. The top 10% of Americans in 1979 were paying 48.1% of all taxes. By 2006, the last date we have good numbers, they were paying 72.8%. The top 40% of all taxpayers in 79 were paying 85.1%, and by 2006 they were paying 98.7% for all practical purposes, all the taxes. The bottom 40% in 1979 paid 4.6%, and by 2006 they were getting 3.3% in direct payments from the Treasury. In fact, the Treasury has become the largest welfare institution in American society. More money is paid out through the Treasury than all the welfare programs in the country combined. Economic growth, which in the 12 years prior to the Reagan program had averaged 2.5%, for the following 25 years averaged 3.3%. Now, when you drop that down to per capita income, here are the numbers. In the 12 years prior to the Reagan program going into effect, per capita GDP in real terms grew by 1.5%. For the 25 years after the Reagan program, Real per capita income grew by 2.2%. Now, to put that into dollar figures for the average American, because of the Reagan program, the average American by 2006 was making $7,400 more than they would have made under the growth rates of the previous 12 years for the Reagan program. And a family of four was making $29,602 more as a result of the expansion and growth that I believe came directly from the Reagan program. In the 12 years prior to the Reagan program, America created 1.3 million jobs a year. We would kill for that number today. But in the Reagan years, job growth was 2 million a year, and that means that as of 2006, there was 17.5 million more Americans at work than would have been working under the growth rates of the pre-Reagan era. Inflation, which had been 7.6% for the previous 12 years, fell to 3.1%. Interest rates plummeted. The average house in America had a monthly payment of $1,000 a month less as a result of the success of the Reagan program. Poverty, which had grown in the 1970s despite massive increases in anti-poverty programs, plummeted despite cuts in poverty programs under the Reagan program. The poverty level fell from 15% to 11.3%. Those results are tangible evidence that government matters, that policy matters. Now, I'm not saying we didn't make mistakes. We, in essence, took 50% of Americans off the tax rolls. In order to get the lower rates, we decided that it would be good politics to simply raise the deductions and take people completely off the tax rolls. In my opinion, that was a mistake. And I think we are suffering from it today. I believe everybody ought to pay income taxes no matter how low their income. But given the net result, you still got to give that work. Even at Hillsdale College, that would be an A. Now, let me conclude by comparing the Reagan recovery to the recovery that we are in today. We are in the most disappointing recovery of the post-war period by a big margin. Even though we read about how disappointing it is in the paper every day, I don't think people understand what an outlier this recovery period is. If the economy had recovered from this recession at the rate it recovered from the 1982 recession, which was roughly the same size in terms of unemployment, we would have 16.3 million more Americans at work today. That would employ everybody who says they're unemployed, plus almost 60% of the discouraged workers who have dropped out of the labor force. Both the Reagan program and the Obama program instituted dramatic changes. One program worked and the other program failed. If per capita income had grown in this recovery at the same rate it grew in the Reagan recovery, per capita income would be $5,139 higher. Now, those are not abstract numbers. Those are real numbers that affect real people. In the end, policy makes a difference. When you have good policy, you have good result. Americans are not the most brilliant, talented people in the world. The plain truth is that while we all love our ancestors, Americans are pretty ordinary people. What is unique about America is that we have had a system that's let ordinary people like us achieve extraordinary things. And if we bring that system back and improve it, and I'm always amazed that looking at how bad government is, even in the best of times, if we really had good government, what we would be capable of doing. And if we have good policies, we will have good results. And a final point, it's not just about money, it's not just about GDP, it's about the kind of people we are. If you have France's government, your people are going to become Frenchmen. If you watch television and you watch these Greek civil servants, you would think they were victimized instead of victimizers. Their policies have made them what they are. What made you who you are is the freedom and responsibility you've had. And if we lose it, it's not just about prosperity. It's not just about prices. It's about who we are. It's about our character. I have a guy who does bulldozer work on my ranch. And he doesn't know a lot about foreign policy. He knows a lot about the economics of the bulldozing business, but he's the equal of any man. He's the stuff empires are made out of. He's proud. He's independent. He knows what he does as well as anybody in America knows what they do. That's what America's about. And so for me, this battle, as it was in 1980, as it is today, is not just about prosperity. It's not just about goods and services. It's about freedom, and it's about the kind of character that only freedom creates. So with that, let me stop and throw it open for questions. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me say before we start the questions, when I went to Washington, I could hear perfectly well. But people yelled at me all those years. And so I don't hear too good, so please talk right into the microphone. And then if I still don't understand, I'll ask Paul what you said. His ears look good. So I'd be very happy to try to answer any questions.
Dr. Gramm, can you hear me?
Yeah.
As you know better than I, our country has suffered, as has much of the world, from the financial crises that have occurred in the last few years. Some of the people analyzing the causes of that with the idea of avoiding it from happening again in the same way have suggested that some of the Glass-Steagall changes perhaps aren't appropriate anymore in view of the factors that caused the problems, and I wondered what your view was on that.
Well, let me first say that everything I did when I was public life, I did because I believed in, but that's not who I am. It's not, it's not part of my personality. If I thought my banking reforms were wrong, I would say so. I don't see any evidence that they had anything to do with the financial crisis. And I would also say that while President Obama campaigned against Gramm Leach Bliley, when he had total control over both houses of Congress and could have rewritten the law any way he wanted to write it. He not only didn't repeal it, but he strengthened it by bringing systemically significant financial institutions that weren't banks under the law and making them financial services holding companies. The financial crisis, in my opinion, is very simple to explain. In fact, I was asked by the governor of the People's Bank of China in 2009 to, in one sentence, explain to him what caused it. And it was a pretty tall order, but I thought a minute and I said, we loaned a whole bunch of money to a whole bunch of people who either couldn't or wouldn't pay it back. And the government had a policy to force banks to make subprime loans under CRA, to force Freddie and Fannie to buy them under the quota system, where at the end 59.7% of all the paper they held had to be subprime. And what happened is the quality of mortgages started to decline. And these mortgages were bundled into securities and then injected into the arteries of the financial system of the world. And so when mortgages started to default, it created a situation where nobody knew which banks were affected and by how much, and we lost the indispensable ingredient in modern finance, and that was trust. Interestingly enough, the one area totally unchanged by the so-called Dodd-Frank bill is anything having to do with the problem itself. The bill, and I won't go on about it, but the bill basically has an agenda of expanding government control over the banking system and politicizing banking decisions. It is so burdensome in terms of red tape and regulation that I would be willing to predict here that if it is not repealed or substantially changed, that within 10 years, 1/3 of all the banks in America will be out of business. Because the small banks can't compete. The regulatory costs are just so great, they can't compete.
Senator Gramm, you and Rick Perry are from the same caste, equally tough. I think he is the strongest and best candidate. On the other hand, he's being excoriated for his position on immigration. Do you think this will sink his candidacy?
The answer is no, I don't think that issue will sink his candidacy. In-state tuition is for residents, not citizens. If the federal government won't enforce the immigration laws and people are here, it's suicidal not to educate them. So I agree with the governor on this issue. I think his challenge is that he had never planned to run. And pressure built up and he decided to run. And so he hadn't done it before. He hadn't spent 4 years preparing to do it. And it's a tough task. If he can learn enough fast enough, he'll win the nomination. But, you know, it's like the old cliches, trying to drink from a fire hose.
Senator Gramm, first of all, I'd like to thank you for coming to speak to us, and I'd like to thank you for your service to America. But my question is, could you outline a specific public policy plan economically that we could use today to get America back on track?
Yeah, I haven't. I mean, I guess I always am outlining plans, but I think a logical thing to do is basically pick a period, say 2006. And then ask ourselves the question, did we have too little government in 2006? Were we suffering from a lack of government in 2006? And I think the answer is no. And so why don't we take spending back to where it was in 2006? And look, everybody knows what's got to be done in entitlements. It's not rocket science. The problem is created by the fact that people are having fewer babies and people are living longer. And our entitlement programs were based on the Bismarck model. Bismarck, when he unified Germany, started the modern entitlement, and it was a brilliant idea of, in a country with a lot of young people and very few old people, with a high birth rate and a high death rate, to guarantee benefits and skip a generation by simply taking the money from young people and giving it to old people, and the old people would get a benefit they never paid for. The only problem with that program, and we have it, is it creates no wealth, and it doesn't benefit from what Einstein called the most powerful force in the universe, compound interest. So now we're closing in on 2 workers for every retiree, and it can't work. And there's no tax rate at which it will work that society won't collapse under its weight. And so what we've got to do are the following things, in my opinion. Number one, we've got to continue phasing up the retirement age at its current rate, not to 67, but to 70. Number two, we've got to index Social Security in the future, not by the wage rate, but by prices. Private pensions aren't even indexed by prices. Those are changes that are no-brainers, in my opinion. And you're not cutting Social Security, you're just not increasing it as much. In Medicare, you've got to have a system where you've got co-payments and deductibles based on income. So, for example, I would be covered by Medicare, but I'd have to spend $50,000 in 1 year before the government started paying, and it would then pay 25 cents on the dollar. And the poorest person in the country might have a $100 deductible and a $2 copayment, but everybody would have a deductible and a copayment. And you would adjust the deductible and the copayment based on the cost of the program. And if people wanted to stay in the old program under that system, they could. If they wanted to go into Paul Ryan's program and have insurance like Congress, they could. I don't think raising the retirement age under Medicare is a good idea. It's one thing for me to keep working when I'm old. I don't know anything but work. But I find when I get up on a ladder cutting branches out of trees or trying to paint under a porch, I have a hard time doing it now, whereas I used to do it and never think about it. So there's some lines of work where you can't keep working when you're 70 years old. And I'm afraid that if we Obama's proposed this, I'm afraid if we do that, we're inviting socialized medicine to come in and take its place. So I wouldn't do that. I think in terms of all of these things we pay people to do, if the market's not demanding it, if people don't want it, we shouldn't do it. There are not many deductibles in the tax code that I get terribly excited about. I would much rather have lower rates. And I do think we could create more growth with lower tax rates. Those are the basic programs I think we need to repeal Obamacare. We need to shut down his regulatory machine. We need to get back to competing I spend a lot of time in China, and there are many things about the Chinese system that I admire. Hard work, unleashed energy from a new freedom people have never had. And it's kind of unseemly that the greatest country in the history of the world goes around complaining about other people not solving our problems. I don't know what it's like in your family, but people don't come solve my problems. I wish they would. My mother used to when I was a child, but my mother's dead, and now I have to do it. America has to do it. We don't need any help. We have had the highest wage rates in the world since the colonial period. Never has an English settler or anybody who came since worked a day in America. We hadn't had the highest wage rates on earth. And yet we've competed because we've done it better. And if you're going to try to produce the same old thing in the same old way, you're not going to do it. Not in the world we live in. So you can wish it away, but look, here's what happened. People looked at America and said, I want what they have. And so they're copying our system. And the world's better off because of it. The changes in China are irreversible. And China's not going away. Korea's not going away. Turkey's not going away. We're going to have to learn to compete again. And we can. That's the good news. I don't have any doubt about it. But we're going to have to do new things. We're going to have to do them better. People are going to have to change. Nobody is guaranteed that they can do the same job forever. And we change better than everybody else, and we've got to learn to change even better than we have. That's my program.
Thanks again, Senator Gramm. You were very eloquent, especially in your defense of freedom, and you're connecting it with character. And generally, I agree with you, but there are a few points where I think a free market may become detrimental to character, as we see in the internet has become in some ways a cesspool of unrighteousness. And economic freedom is very important, but I'm not sure that it's enough. I mean, would you speak to that enough to guarantee character?
In what way it's not enough? It's not enough in many areas, but you tell me which one you're talking about.
Okay. Well, there are markets for good things, and there are markets for bad things. There are markets for things like abortion and pornography, and I don't think those are good things. Now, I'm not sure that the government should legislate against them, but if we're talking about increasing freedom and increasing character, those don't seem to be as simply connected as you made them, and I'd like to hear more on that.
Okay, let me make it clear that when I'm talking about economic freedom, I'm talking about economic freedom within the rule of law. Criminal activities do not represent economic freedom. They violate economic freedom. But with economic freedom, I'm talking about the ability of people to use their God-given talent to produce and sell things that don't harm other people, and a chance of people to get on the playing field, and a reduction in the ability of people who are already on the playing field to keep them off. Those are the things that I'm talking about. We got two over here.
Thank you. I'm wondering from your perspective why poverty has just been so stubborn, and is our approach just totally inadequate?
Well, I don't think our programs have been inadequate. I think they've been wrong. I wonder what I would be like if we had had welfare programs when I was a child. My mama worked in a cotton mill for $8 a week. She went to her grave saying she would never have taken welfare, but if she lived today, everybody she would know would be taking it. People would mock her for not taking it. She would probably take it. I don't know what my world would be like. Much of what we see as poverty today is a monument to the failure of our program. And I hope I don't offend anybody, but look at Detroit, Michigan, a great city that at one time was the model of what American productivity was about. And look at it today. What produced that? Bad government. I wonder sometimes what the world would be like if we'd never had a welfare program. Now, I know it would have been hard on individuals, but I wonder how many more happy, productive people we would have. And I don't know about you, but when I drive past these blighted areas and I see people just wandering around, to me, just the wasted lives is heartbreaking. And government produced that. And if we change the policies, we'll change the people. Yeah, there was a guy in the back. He looks like a subversive. Yeah. These young people, you got to watch. You never know what they got on their mind.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Graham. My question is, as we've seen presidential candidate Herman Cain gain a lot of momentum in the last few weeks, in part because of his economic growth plan, the 999 plan that we've heard a lot about. I would like to hear your opinion of that plan and whether or not you think it would work.
Well, I don't know Herman Cain. I have been impressed by him. I think he is a great image for the Republican Party. And maybe I'm just old and jaded, but I think at this point that either Perry or Romney is going to be the nominee. Let me tell you my problem with the 999 thing. In the 1970s, Europe brought in the value-added tax under the pledge that it was ultimately going to replace the income tax. And it didn't. And if you look at the size of American governments compared to European government, it was in that period where between 5 and 10 percentage points of GDP distance was created. And I would never support a value-added tax unless we repeal the 16th Amendment and eliminated the income tax. What I don't want is a new form of taxes. Now, I never got very excited about tax reform. I'm very much in favor of it. It's so obvious that we ought to have a simpler system with fewer deductions and lower rates. But anything you do can be gamed. Even with a value-added tax, you can have premiums for higher price commodities. And so in the end, the debate is more about how much government's going to spend than it is about how you collect it. Now, you can collect it more or less efficiently. I certainly agree with that. But in the end, I have always cared most about keeping government small. I believe there's a limit beyond which you can't let government grow without endangering freedom, even the best government in the history of the world. Government is inherently inefficient, will always be inefficient. No matter who is president, it's inefficient. When you are spending somebody else's money, you do not spend it as efficiently as you do your own. and therefore government should be kept as small as we can keep it, consistent with the clear needs of the public, like public health, national defense. And I would apply a Yellow Pages test. If it's in the Yellow Pages, you can buy it in the private sector, government ought not to be doing it. Now, that probably dates me. There's probably not a student at this college who's ever looked in the Yellow Pages. They somehow turn on this machine and it just pops, things just come forward. It's some miracle. Yeah, I got one more question.
Hello, thank you for speaking tonight. You've talked a lot about incentives from the federal government on a personal level, and I was just wondering if you could talk about maybe some business incentives from the federal government, how they're structured, and maybe how we could improve on them.
I missed the last part of it. Ask me a question again.
Just, I was wondering if you could talk about the federal, business incentives from a federal level, and how maybe we could improve on them. Business incentives. Sorry.
Well, one of the first things I'd get rid of is business incentives. If you need incentives to do something, you probably ought not to do it. And look, solar energy is a perfect example. I use solar energy on my ranch. And I use wind energy. Why? Because it's cheaper than either using a diesel-powered generator or running a line 3 miles. So I'm using it because it's efficient, but it is not efficient where you've got access to conventional electricity. Solar power has been around a long time, and it is going to come into general use if and when it becomes competitive. I know this is a shocking revelation to government, but new technologies are adopted if and only if they are cheaper when you count all cost. You never adopt, quote, more expensive technologies. It's not the way the world works. And we're going to end up squandering vast amounts of money in electric cars that nobody's going to buy except people who want to make a statement, which is great. I just want them to make it with their money, not with my money. And if you want to cover your roof up with solar panels, great. But don't make me pay for it. And we're not going to make it efficient any faster. These projects that we're funding are not new technology. You know, with pure research, there's a case that can be made for government funding. But once you get into commercialization, there is no case that can be made. Engineering, physics may be something government can fund, but engineering is not. And I think that's a very bright line, and I would always recognize it, and I would never step over it. Well, let me conclude by saying thank you so much for having me, and let me say to the students who are here, you are very blessed to be in a place where people still believe in and advocate freedom. It is the only real revolutionary idea in history. The old idea that somewhere somebody knows better than you, or that government can solve problems, those are old, tried, tested, and failed ideas. The revolutionary idea of our time is the idea that free men and women, given the ability to use that freedom within the rule of law, can become the richest, freest, and happiest people in the world, and a beacon to the world that the whole world aspires to. Amen. Amen. Thank you.